Nico Rosberg is right. Lewis Hamilton is looking for excuses. Lance Stroll has a mental mechanical failure, yes. In Formula One, everything is watched, including Hülkenberg, and that's why I hope that Toto Wolff takes a good look and simply takes him.
Hello dear motorsport-magazin.com friends and Formula One fans to AvD Motorsport Magazine with Christian Danner in issue number 5. Welcome, thank you very much for taking the time again.
Welcome back, I'm always happy to be here.
China Grand Prix was so, well, how did you like it?
Oh God, you get used to this kind of racing. There's always just one guy at the front. The other is desperately trying to catch up. Sometimes it works out for position 2, sometimes not. And for the rest, you have to look very closely to see who is where, when and how, which strategy, which tire works and what doesn't work. So I would say that the China Grand Prix was a standard Grand Prix as it is these days. Although I had a bit of hope because the weather was mixed and drizzly and so on, but nothing changed.
Unfortunately, the strategic specialties were affected a bit by the safety car, so we no longer had that variance. But as you mentioned, one of us is somehow desperately trying to chase Verstappen, and one of us is now chasing him quite desperately, you could say. He delivered a really strong performance in the sprint, Lewis Hamilton in second place, and then a few hours later in qualifying he was out in Q1. So I'd say we're mixing up our two favorite topics a bit. We've often talked about Lewis Hamilton here in this format, and we've also often talked about racing driver excuses. Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton's former teammate, addressed this relatively clearly. He said that these are all excuses from Lewis Hamilton because he keeps coming up with setup directions and so on. So what is the truth? Are they mistakes? Are they excuses? How should that be assessed?
Well, I think Nico Rosberg is absolutely right. Of course, they are excuses. Because, I mean, braking a bit in the hairpin in Shanghai, well, that's happened to me too, but it's really nothing dramatic. But if it's normally a matter of the sausage here in qualifying, whether I get through or not, then of course it's a big problem. And nothing else went wrong with Lewis Hamilton in qualifying. So now let's come back to Lewis. In the years that he was so dominant, when he was driving with Rosberg, for example, he sometimes actually messed up or somehow went in the wrong direction in terms of setup. But that was relatively easy. He simply took what Rosberg had. That then worked. And if the car was basically next door, it wasn't so far next door that you couldn't still win. So it was a very comfortable time at Mercedes with the new engines and with this car, which was extremely, extremely superior for many years, in which you could feel at ease. It goes without saying that when you can feel comfortable, you also perform better. Now, Lewis Hamilton has simply come down to earth. That is Formula One. It is not always fun. You have to drive a car where nothing works. And I think that instead of always complaining so easily about what he tends to do, quite clearly, you should just put your head down and talk to the engineers. And even if Toto Wolff says that the drivers have no influence on the car, the engineers have to build it. So I will tell you honestly, I would sit in Brackley and shave the top of their heads and bombard them with the things that are important to me as a driver. And not say, yes, set up. No, there is only one thing to do. Go there, take action, do it, convince the engineers and somehow try to find the gremlin that's stuck in this stupid car and finish it off. In my opinion, that's the job that Lewis should actually be doing.
We talked a bit about this in one of the last issues. I think Lewis Hamilton is not so much in Brackley lately, but at least in his head in Maranello. If we look at the mistake itself, you said that you've already made a mistake on the hairpin. One direction was one explanation. Two drivers were hit particularly hard. Zhou was eliminated in Q1 because of that, and Lewis Hamilton, it almost hurts a little when I lump them together like that. The 7-time world champion with Guan Yu Zhou, who got caught out by the wind. Couldn't you have guessed that?
Yes.
Can that happen to a 7-time world champion?
These days, the rider gets everything that's available in the way of information, and that includes the wind. I can't imagine that he wasn't told, watch out, there's a tailwind at the end of the straight. That's a bit stupid, you have to be a bit careful. But the whole wind issue, yes, wind is a problem for every race car, but the fact that you slow down also has a little bit to do with feeling, and I don't think you always have to find an excuse in this case either. Yes, the wind was pushing like that. Yes, my God, I still have to somehow make sure they get around. Yes, wind affects the cars, no question about it. The aerodynamics. Yes, it's better from the front than from the rear. But that's never been any different because the laws of physics haven't changed on this planet. And I think it must be possible for a driver of this caliber to deal with that. So a mistake is a mistake. What you can interpret into it afterwards doesn't matter. A mistake is a mistake. If the others can do it, then you have to be able to do it yourself.
I'm going to play a bit like Toto Wolff and try to defend the driver. We know that the Silver Arrow is not the superior car, and Mercedes is already working on it. I think you could almost say they're tinkering the way they're somehow lost. Maybe they're trying to make the impossible possible with the setup and somehow make this car fast. And maybe they get bogged down a bit and make it difficult for the drivers.
Yes, that happens again and again. If the car does not give you anything, you build to the left, build to the right, upwards and downwards, and see which way the car is actually better. And of course, you also make radical changes, because you cannot just move forward with micro steps, because then nothing changes. Personally, however, I suspect that the car has a very old, well-known problem, namely a lack of structural integrity. In other words, a structure that is not rigid enough. It is strong enough not to break apart while driving, but somewhere along the monocoque or at the pickup points of the wheel suspension, something bends. Somewhere what you find, again, bleeds out drop by drop from the performance. And these are normally things that are difficult to find, because you can measure a monocoque like this, but it's a difficult case until you've finished measuring it. And whether it's really the monocoque or some other components, gearbox, housing, engine, pickup, there are so many things. But for me, it all points to the fact that they are constantly going round in circles, improving the aerodynamics, trying everything possible, and it's always no good, except in the rain, where the load on the overall structure is much lower. And that worked. Yes, of course, fewer forces are transmitted. That means it doesn't have to be as stiff.
So it's a really interesting story at this point. Of course, we'll be following this a little more closely over the next few weeks. Let's move away from Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes for a moment and look at racing driver excuses in general. One of our favorite topics. How much can you actually believe a racing driver in general?
Yes, well, nowadays it's become an example. In the past, you weren't allowed to believe anything they said because, of course, they did everything, so we didn't have anyone watching our backs. Sorry, that wasn't the transparent driver. Nowadays, drivers are transparent. You should think very carefully about whether you are somehow fibbing or finding some excuse. The engineers will find out immediately whether it was or wasn't the case. That's why I think the days of wild racing driver excuses are over. And of course, that also applies to spectacular excuses like, let's say, Lance Stroll running over Ricciardo, completely overlooks him, makes a total banana move. And what comes out, he'd be like, yeah, he braked much harder, so sorry. Nowadays, that can be refuted with pictures, sound, and data. So the really nice racing driver excuses, the times are, I'll say it now, I have to speak for my colleagues, unfortunately over.
What was your wildest racing driver excuse?
Oh, I was always honest. Yes. No. So, of course, excuses are mainly made when you have had a collision. He crashed into this car or he crashed into there. Otherwise, when I was thrown out, I usually just admitted it. I was too stupid or too fast or both. And when there were collisions, of course, there was always a need for discussion. There were arguments about whether he should have been there or whether I should have been there. So sometimes I did, I'll say, put a subjective point of view on record. But basically, it just helps if you are honest. So that's just as true in motorsport as it is in other areas of life.
Subjective views put on record. I will remember that as a euphemism for racing driver excuses. Before I get you any further into this whole excuse thing, I will give you a short break and we'll go back over there to one of our favorite sections. We let our viewers have their say in the Ask AvD section. Yes, Nico Hülkenberg is a driver who almost goes under the radar a little because he's not at the front of the field, but has still put in a really strong performance in recent races. Now 10th place for him in China too, dusting off points again with the Haas, and that's why we're now doing a little Hülki blog in our Ask AvD blog. Because if he doesn't get enough attention from us, he doesn't get enough attention from the fans out there. The first question comes from ABC Gaming X. And they are of the opinion that Hülkenberg is really good. Yes, but what is the benchmark with Kevin Magnussen? So is Hülki that good, or is Magnussen's time in Formula One actually over?
So I think Hülkenberg is good enough to answer the question quite simply. Kevin Magnussen, let's not forget, is a man who was incredibly fast in his Formula One career. We are welcome to ask Romain Grosjean, and I've done so personally, who has told me time and time again, tell me guys, there's no such thing. The dog is so fast. Why doesn't anyone notice that? We can ask Mick Schumacher that, who didn't see any land at all against Kevin Magnussen. No, I'm sticking to my guns. Nico Hülkenberg is particularly good. And what I like so much about him is that he is also particularly unspectacular. He drives hard, fast, focused, risk conscious. His risk management is also very pronounced. Of course, you're always close and sometimes you have to make a decision that could have gone wrong. But I think he's doing an excellent job, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed for him that things will go uphill from time to time.
As if Wolfgang Schuster had already heard your answer, he immediately asks the follow-up question to your, yes, I don't want to say adulation, to your song of praise. Let's call it analysis. But Wolfgang Schuster wants to know, does Hülkenberg have a chance of getting a Red Bull cockpit? He even clarifies that Hülki would be the better wingman for Verstappen than Perez, especially because of his qualifying performance.
Well, we agree on that, I think. What Sergio Perez has delivered over the course of time, or almost years, is not that great. Yes, okay, there are drivers like Verstappen that you can't really keep up with, but then with such a superior car, you should at least be a safe second. That's the Piquet Patrese, Menzel Patrese number. Riccardo Patrese also always drove very well. Wasn't always as fast as the team leader, but he was so fast that he always managed to finish on the podium. So I can well imagine that if we put Nico in there at Red Bull, he would do a much more considered better job than Sergio Perez. Is that likely? I do not quite think so, because the Red Bull empire still has access to one or two drivers, and it also depends very much on how things develop there. The advantage that Nico has is that he has already worked as a TV pundit, as a colleague of mine at Service TV, therefore at Red Bull. He would already be a member of the family, so to speak, and I'm sure he has already made an inquiry.
Our viewers are obviously clairvoyant, because as if Zeratox had heard this answer again, he immediately throws the next possibility into the room if it doesn't work out at Red Bull. How about Hülkenberg at Mercedes? At least until Antonelli is ready, he could take the Mercedes cockpit.
After what we saw at the Chinese Grand Prix, if I were Toto Wolff, I would definitely give it a lot of thought. The man is simply reliable. He's not a one driver today, one driver tomorrow, and certainly not a miracle bag like Andrea Kimi Antonelli. because I still have my problems with Kimi Antonelli. Not that he is a very good driver, but I am struggling to assess how he'll cope in the Formula One circus. Because he already has a very, how should I put it, slightly temperamental, pompous manner. Through the junior classes, of course he delivered, of course he was fast and won, but that ends very quickly in Formula One. And I know Toto Wolff wants at all costs to avoid Verstappen slipping through his fingers, or a potentially new Verstappen slipping through his fingers. But whether that's the case, whether it is the ideal lineup, I don't know. In my opinion, Hülkenberg would always be better. And Nico, I am pretty sure, is talking to everything that's possible at the moment. And that also includes Mercedes, of course. I would take him.
A nice closing word for our Hülkenberg blog, and thus also a closing word for AskAvD, hashtag to that. And then you can put your questions to our expert Christian Danner here. Then we'll go back to last weekend. It was the first weekend with the new sprint format, new layout, new Parc Fermé rules. How did you like it?
Well, I've already come out several times. I am not a sprint fan, whether it is called sprint qualifying or sprint shootout beforehand, whether if it is the sprint or qualifying race or whatever other name has existed. I just find it a bit superfluous. Yes, it is. It's more fun for the spectators to watch them race compared to a few long runs that happen. But I wouldn't be a big fan of this format for many, many reasons. The one thing that was indeed an improvement was the change in the Parc Fermé rules that applied in China. They meant that if the thing didn't work at all, see Hülkenberg, you still have a chance to rebuild for the race. I would say that was a pragmatically sensible solution. And it shows that if you have the right arguments, I would say, you will also find that the FOM and the FIA are receptive. So it has definitely proved its worth. And we still have a few such sprints ahead of us. I say I always have to put up with it somehow, because for me the Grand Prix on Sundays is the race. And that's enough for me. Even as an insider, that's enough for me, because the way you drive a sprint is, of course, completely different from the way you drive a Grand Prix. And that's why, okay, we'll watch if we have to. But that doesn't mean I have to become a big fan. And I don't grumble either, because it's motorsport after all, and we're happy with that.
Now everyone can see for themselves how they found the new arrangement of the sessions. Personally, I found it a bit easier in my head because you didn't have to go back to Friday on Sunday. Maybe my cognitive abilities are a bit limited, but now I'd like to hear the racer's perspective. What's it like when you suddenly go back into qualifying a few hours later after the sprint race on Saturday? That's pretty difficult for the driver this time.
I also imagined what it would be like for me sitting in the car and driving in the race. And after the race, you're always a bit burnt out. You've got a race behind you, an award ceremony behind you. You're somehow a bit exhausted. Then to pull yourself together and drive qualifying, which is a very, I'll say, mental exercise. That means you have to concentrate very hard and be incredibly focused to get everything right in Q1, Q2, Q3. So I thought to myself, it's not easy. And I'm sure that the challenge of driving a qualifying session like that is certainly greater than if I'd been driving a free practice session beforehand, where I tried out a fresh set of soft tires without fuel. I was able to try out a fresh set of soft tires and then implement it a few hours later in qualifying. This is certainly simpler from a driver's point of view, easier to understand and less difficult than what we have now. But yes, you also have to manage it. You just have to find a method and a way to cope with it and stay focused. The good ones manage it.
The sprint as such is also a perfect example of how Formula One is constantly trying to reinvent itself, open up new markets and so on. Now, another change has been discussed this weekend and will possibly be discussed a little more than just in the next Formula One commission. Points system. I know it's also a little matter of the heart. In your day, the top 6 still got points. Now the top 10 get them, and it's still not enough for many. Kevin Magnussen even says there should be points for everyone. Then it's also worth fighting for something back there.
Yes.
I suppose you see it a little differently.
Yes, totally different. For me, a championship point is very valuable. And the more of them there are, the more diluted the soup of World Championship points becomes. It would become a flood of points, and I think that's really the wrong way to go about it. If the first 10 points are to be awarded, okay, then I would still prefer the first 6. Because it's always the case that only those who are really far ahead should get the points. A championship point is incredibly valuable, and I've experienced that firsthand and also felt how great it is when you get one of those. I understand the top 10, it's a good compromise, but I think anything that goes beyond that is a bit watered down and simply not good. It takes away and dilutes the value of a championship point. That's why I think that's completely the wrong approach.
That is perhaps a romantic view, but if you look at it a bit pragmatically, it's true that cars are so reliable nowadays that they don't have to break down like they used to, and so the backbenchers can sometimes get into the points. Do you still have to find a middle way because there are virtually no more technical retirements apart from Valtteri Bottas?
Yes, or Lance Stroll, a mental mechanical failure. But joking aside, yes, that is absolutely right. The cars are holding up much better. That means that the chance of scoring points or even come close to scoring points is extremely difficult for the poorer and smaller teams. But I still think it is a compromise that you have to make and that you have to find. And I think, as I've just said, I've already made friends with the top 10. It's not like that. I'm not railing against it. I think it's a very good compromise that if you finish in the top 10, you also get points. It's also simple and easy to understand. The 10th place finisher has this 1 point. That's all somehow tangible and a good compromise, I think. But more. I'm simply of the opinion that it's not good, because the positions 11th, 12th and so on count just as much for the Constructors' World Championship. It's not as if the positions are forgotten and end up in the garbage can. They count. And if someone finishes 11th 4 times, that's still better than if they only finish 11th 3 times. And that's why I think the top 10 is fine.
So it's definitely an interesting discussion at this point. Now we have prepared a real treat to round off this issue. I don't know what your experiences in drifting are like. Do they even exist, the experiences?
Not yet. They don't exist yet. But I have already registered. I definitely want to take part in the Drift Challenge this year. I have to experience that. That's Motorsport 2. And I've already tried out lots of things, driven lots of different racing cars. And of course, I've also tried out different categories, had a taste of it, and that's something I'm still missing, and I really need to get my hands on it. I think it's pretty cool.
But the coolest thing is now we're finding out what it's actually all about, the AvD Drift Championship. It's a very interesting championship, especially for us, as we're not really familiar with it yet, but that's exactly why we spoke to the organizer, Martin Montag. He is not only the organizer of the AvD Drift Championship, but has also been actively involved in the sport for almost 20 years. He also drives himself. And we are now learning from him what drifting actually is, how the whole thing works, which cars are used and all this in our AvD pit stop.
drift sport is all about having predefined routes that are mastered by two vehicles. Put simply, one vehicle drives along a given route with so-called clipping zones, for example, and a second vehicle tries to copy the first vehicle as well as possible. The whole thing is scored, just like figure skating. But in this case with a jury?
The jury is an interesting keyword. I personally don't know this from motorsport. Does that mean there are only subjective criteria, or are there also objective criteria, perhaps even sensors that are somehow read out?
Not with sensors. It's a very difficult sport in the area of jury evaluation. You really have to know the sport for many years, because it's also about using the riding techniques that the respective protagonist uses in the jury evaluation. It's all about speed, steering angles, riding techniques, and above all, the line. And that's a conglomerate on which there are 100 points to be scored. And this is assessed by 3 independent jury members who each have years of experience in the sport.
So this is how it works. 1 duel, 2 participants. I can imagine that there will be a few more participants in total. What does a whole weekend format like this look like?
That is correct. There are usually an average of 40 participants, and there is a big free training session first where everyone can prepare for the line. Then there are always briefings in between when certain routes are minimally readjusted. Then it's on to qualifying, which is individual. Each driver drives the track 3 times and the best run is scored. And then it's one-on-one. In other words, a top 16 will be held in Germany. That means 16 runs with 2 runs each, unless the decision is so close that there is another so-called rewind or a one more time. These are the technical terms in the sport. And then it's one-on-one all the way through to the final.
And which tracks are used? I can't imagine that the entire Nordschleife will be drifted through.
What the tires won't do, that was tried once, but you needed a few tire seats. We are on 3 racetracks in Germany, the Hockenheimring, Lausitzring and Oschersleben. At the Nürburgring this year, we only have a show run, but no championship run. Otherwise, as part of the tuning world at Bodensee, a track will be built in the outdoor area with barriers, etc., so that we can hold a championship race within this trade fair, and at the PSDs in Hanover on the exhibition grounds in Hanover. So 4 racetracks and twice at an exhibition center.
Do you ride the entire route or just sections of it?
Always track sections. We usually have between 6 and 1,000 meters of parkour that you have to master, or a racetrack area. These are the scoring zones.
And finally, the most important question, which cars are actually being driven there?
Drifting is a very special sport. There are lots of super interesting engine swaps that are used, lots of Corvette LS engines that are squeezed into some small Japanese chassis, for example. In that respect, the sport is super interesting because you see things that don't normally exist. For example, that a Toyota Supra suddenly has a 7-liter supercharged V8 with 1,000 horsepower in it. There are many Japanese chassis, otherwise dominated by BMW in Europe.
That looks very spectacular. Great pictures. I'm even more in the mood now to get in there.
And if you fancy it too, then maybe you can't get in yourself, you can't drive it yourself, but you can at least watch it. The whole thing kicks off next weekend on April 28th at the Tuning Masters at the Hockenheimring. More information can be found at www.driftchampionship.com. So much for our excursion into drifting, but we'll see you again in our tried and tested Formula One in 2 weeks' time in Miami, and we're already back to sprinting. In other words, whether we like it or not, we have a lot to talk about again.
I would also say we have more to talk about with Sprint, so it's all good. Whatever the topic, if you have a question or two for me, use the hashtag AskAvD.